An entire section of this video is dedicated to the ending of FMA Brotherhood, so I mean it when I say that there are major spoilers ahead. You have been warned. Fullmetal Alchemist is, in my humble opinion, not only the greatest shonen ever made, but also one of the greatest pieces of fiction ever written. It's got something for everyone. Action, philosophy, conspiracy, a touch of romance, and a well-rounded cast of characters. The story takes place in a European-like setting instead of a Japanese high school, and handles subject matter as heavy as genocide with enough delicacy and somberness to still come across as genuine. I'm here to argue that what makes FMA so successful is that Hiromu Arakawa doesn't abide by the rules set by the shonen genre, often choosing to challenge them instead, which is evident in the character of Edward Elric. Separating Ed from most other anime MCs are his unique motives, his particular strengths, or lack thereof, and how his journey is resolved. Much to his dismay, Ed is short, he's far from being the strongest character in the series, and has not one but two prosthetic limbs, which technically makes him disabled. Granted, he does live in a universe in which automail is a thing, but it's by no means an easy fix. He has to undergo a full year of grueling rehabilitation in order to use it. He has to train regularly to keep himself limber and allow his body time to adapt to his artificial limbs. Because he's still growing, he has to have his prosthetics refitted every few months. He can't handle being outside in extreme temperatures without risking severe burns or frostbite, and he even comments on changes in the weather making his stumps ache. The manga goes so far as to depict him having bouts of phantom limb pain. By the time Ed's journey has started, his innocence has been stripped from him, as he's already experienced the worst the world has to offer. At least that's what he's led to believe, but as it turns out, things can always get worse. It's this early encounter of extreme suffering, however, that acts as the catalyst for Ed's unwavering resolve, as well as his call to action. Ed and Al's journey does not start out the way most shonen stories do. Unlike your average happy-go-lucky protagonist who embarks on a journey out of a sense of adventure or attention-seeking, Ed is looking for something different, a means of rectifying the situation that he caused. Alphonse was also complicit in attempting to bring their mother back from the dead, but the whole thing was Ed's idea, and being the older brother, he feels solely responsible for what happened to the two of them. When Colonel Mustang visits their quiet abode, Ed is presented with two choices: let despair and regret consume him as he wastes away in a chair, or crawl his way to the light at the end of the tunnel and search for a way forward. He becomes a dog of the military, not purely for the sake of power or recognition, but because these things will help him on his mission to find a Philosopher's Stone, which promises to be the solution to the Elric brothers' problems. To Ed, money, notoriety, and the adventure itself are all a means to an end. At the beginning of his story, the antagonists aren't even there to challenge Ed's ideals because he doesn't really start out with any. Ed's initial focus is very narrow. He doesn't care what the Amestrian military is planning or what crimes they've committed. He doesn't even care all that much about restoring his own limbs, because to him, restoring Al's body takes priority. Everything else ceases to matter. This of course changes once the brothers uncover the truth of how Philosopher's Stones are created, and they're forced to reevaluate what lengths they're willing to go to restore what they've lost. Several characters point out to Ed that it's naive of him to think that he can be a part of the military without taking lives in the process, while also acknowledging that this naive idealism is to be expected, seeing as he was only 12 when he signed up and is no more than a teenager throughout the course of the story. But Ed and Al's resolution to never take or even use the lives of others for their own gain stays strong all the same. Ed is already placed at a disadvantage in several ways when it comes to combat, and the self-imposed restriction to never aim to kill only adds to the list. But Edward has ways of compensating nonetheless. Ed is rather lacking in physical prowess. He's agile, but not particularly muscular, and his attacks don't have quite as much power behind them compared to those of your typical shonen MCs. Generally, Ed provides more value as an intellectual rather than a direct combatant, such as when he figures out a way to escape Gluttony's stomach and how to best deal with Pride's shadows. Because he doesn't have the option of brute forcing his way through the villain of the week, Ed has to make use of that pink fleshy thing in his noggin to outsmart them instead. My favorite example of this being his first encounter with Greed. Greed is one of the 7 homunculus, meaning he can regenerate almost instantly. On top of this, he has the ability to change the molecular structure of his body, giving him a full suit of impenetrable armor. So, how's Ed even supposed to fight this guy? After getting ragdolled around for a while, Ed clues into the fact that Greed's ultimate shield is not simply magic unique to the homunculus, but is actually a form of alchemy. Greed forms his shield by condensing the carbon in his body, thus hardening his skin. In retaliation, Ed uses alchemy to change the structure of Greed's skin, thereby screwing up his ability to form his shield and giving him a chance to damage him. Ed is still on track to losing until Azumi shows up, but the fact he was able to keep up with a practically immortal homunculus is pretty impressive. While we're on the topic, Ed gets his ass kicked. Like, a lot. He tends to lose more fights than he wins, and most of those wins are a result of other characters backing him up. But this ties into an important theme surrounding the Elric brothers, knowing when to accept help from others. One could argue that the power of friendship is already a constant throughout most shonen, but FMA chooses to show us what that actually looks like instead of telling us. Ed is forced to lean on others for support whether he likes it or not. He needs Winry around to provide regular maintenance to his automail. If it weren't for Mustang's pep talk, he'd likely still be confined to a wheelchair, and later in the story he even has to rely on one of his former enemies to help decode important research notes. Whenever Ed does rely too heavily on himself in a situation, he gets admonished for it, such as when he sneaks off to investigate the 5th laboratory. Ed may be important to the plot, but he doesn't receive quite as much plot armor as most other main characters. In the world of FMA, teamwork is rewarded and self-reliance is punished, which gives the other characters plenty of opportunities to shine. I'd also argue that Ed's willingness to put up with both emotional and physical pain on a consistent basis is a rather underrated form of strength that his character encapsulates quite well. Every shonen protagonist is gifted with special powers to separate them from the rest of the cast and make them a point of interest within their narrative. The same could be said of Ed, but to a lesser extent. He's considered a prodigy for having learned complex alchemy at a young age, and he doesn't require a transmutation circle in order to use it. But that little trick literally cost him an arm and a leg. Ed could easily inflate his title and put himself on a pedestal, but unlike other state alchemists, Ed doesn't view himself as being inherently better than anyone else. He is, after all, only human, and will always be flawed whether he can use alchemy or not. The final resolution of Ed's journey is not the acquisition of power, but instead the opposite, learning how to live without it. The main conflict Edward faces is not only the world itself, but also his hubris. He's willing to become ordinary, but ironically can be seen as unordinary because of it. All that really matters to Ed is that he has family waiting for him and his brother to return. By the final episode of Brotherhood, Ed and Al have regained what they lost, with the exception of Ed's left leg, which acts as a constant reminder of the trials the brothers had to go through in order to wrestle back their normal, quiet lives. Edward's final sacrifice, his subversion of what we typically define as strength, and the start of his journey being rooted in guilt are what make his character and story stand out among all the others occupying the same genre. Rather than building an epic spanning hundreds upon hundreds of episodes, Arakawa has the decency to end her story where she sees fit. The Elric brothers have come full circle, having hit all of their important thematic points along the way. FMA's universe is still large enough to leave other lands and ideas unexplored, but leaving them that way doesn't diminish anything about the story we were given. Thanks for watching. This is my first video covering FMA Brotherhood out of 3, so there'll be 2 more to keep an eye out for in the coming months, which may make it a good idea to subscribe if you haven't already.